Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of videos here on YouTube to help you play chess better. In today's video, I'm going to start with a little story. Back about 22 years ago, I was taking my son and some of his friends to a chess tournament, and my son said to me, "Dad, there's a guy on the chess team who hurt his foot. He can't play, a guy on the tennis team who hurt his foot, and he can't play tennis right now, so he'd like to go with us to the chess tournament. Can he go with us?" And I said, "Sure." So this gentleman's name was Mike Glick, and we took Mike up to North Penn to play in the chess tournament, and I watched him and the other guys playing. And I noticed something, even though it was Mike's first tournament. When he was paired with adults who were rated 13 and 1400 and they got into complicated positions, Mike simply figured out the tactics better. And he won every game that he played against people at that level. And I noticed right away that he kind of had that tactical spark. He knew how to figure out which moves were safe and which moves weren't safe. And his opponents were not able to keep up with him, even though they had been playing in tournaments for many years. And Mike was able to beat them. This all leads up to today's video, which is on my book, Back to Basics Tactics. Back to Basics Tactics is published by Russell Enterprises. They have a bunch of Back to Basics books, and I was asked to write the book Back to Basics Tactics. I'm happy to say it's now in a third printing. The book third printing came out in 2018. The first printing had some typos. We were able to fix it in the second printing, and the third printing, of course, is even cleaner. So we have the book, and the question is, when do you read a book like that? Well, it's not meant to be your very first book on safety. It's not as basic as John Bain's Chess Tactics for Students, or Margolis and Fisher's book, Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess, or even Ward's book, Starting Out, I think it's called Starting Out Chess Tactics and Sacrifice, or Chess Tactics and Combinations, I think. Anyway, my book's a little bit more advanced than that, but not a lot more. So it would be like the second or third tactics book you would get. And one thing I like about my book is it covers a lot of distance. It probably has the most comprehensive chapter on counting of any basic tactics book that I know. And when I say counting, I don't just mean the value of the pieces. I mean figuring out whether capturing sequences wins material or not. I have an earlier couple videos here on YouTube that I did on counting, so you can check those out. But my book has that. It has chapters on defensive tactics. It has chapters on, how do you know if there's to look for a tactic or not. These are all very important practical issues. So what I'd like to do is do a sampling of some of the problems in my book, Back to Basics Tactics. Let's start with a problem here from the counting chapter. And the question here is it safe for white to win the pawn on d4? So can white safely capture the pawn on d4? Well, if we just do some basic counting, white has a knight, a rook, and a queen attacking d4, and black has a bishop and a queen guarding d4. The problem is that there's other pieces involved and other squares involved. For instance, if white takes with the rook first on d4, black doesn't have to worry about whether or not how many pieces white has guarding it, because he can simply play bishop takes d4, and no matter how white captures on d4, white would be down the exchange for a pawn, the exchange meaning a rook for a bishop or a knight. Also, white has to watch out. The queen is overworked trying to recapture on d4 and guard the bishop on b3, so that's an issue also. On the surface, it looks like maybe white can play knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, because then black can't play queen takes d4 because the queen's guarding it, and he can't play queen takes b3 because the queen's guarding that. However, that's incorrect. If we look one move further and don't make a quiescence error and stop too soon, after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, black can play queen takes d4, because if white plays queen takes d4, black simply plays rook to e1, checkmate. That's enough to tell us already that white can't take the pawn on d4. The pawn on d4 is safe. If you came up with the answer that knight takes d4 is bad because black can play rook d8, and pin the knight to the queen and try to win it, that's also sufficient. But black doesn't need to do that. He can just simply keep capturing on d4 and then go after the mate on the e1 square. All right, so let's go to the second problem. All right, in this problem, it's white to play, and what's his best move? Can he win material? What can he do? Well, we can see that white's attacking the pawn on c7 twice with the pawn on d6 and the bishop indirectly on f4, but black's attacking the pawn on c3, which is en prise. It's not guarded at all. So if white simply tries to play d takes c7, then black can play queen takes c3 check and get his pawn back. Is there anything else white can do? Well, yes, white can try to trap the bishop with a move like d7. The real question would then be, can black play queen takes c3 check and get enough of an attack to get at least a draw out of it and make sure that white can't win the bishop? So let's look at a couple lines. d7, queen takes c3 check, and now simply queen to d2. If queen takes d2 check, then rook takes d2, and that pawn on d7 is now guarded. If bishop takes d7, then rook takes d7. If d7, queen takes c3 check, rook d2, and now, queen takes c3 check, queen d2, queen takes d2 check, rook takes d2. If then black plays rook d8, then just d takes c8, get a queen, and the rook on d2 is guarded, and white has no problems. Finally, let's look at the line d7, rook d8, trying to pin the pawn to the queen. White can then play d takes c8 queen, and black cannot play rook takes d5, recapturing the queen, because the new queen on c8 is pinning that rook on d8 to the king, which means black would have to take time to play rook on a takes c8, and then white would save the queen, and white ends up winning that bishop. So it turns out that after we check all the lines, the d7 does trap the bishop, and even though white might lose the pawn on c3 and the pawn on d7, he gets the bishop for the two pawns and ends up ahead. With careful play, he should be winning. All right, let's go to the next problem. Your ability to figure out problems like this correctly, quickly, and accurately is a very big key to how good a chess player you are. All right, this is white to play. And the question is, what's the best thing that white can do here? And this is the kind of problem that I think most good players would get pretty quickly. By the way, if you're doing the problems along with me in this video and you want to take some time on the problem, simply pause the video, do the problem. For instance, here, you could pause the video and find out, what do you think white's best move is? Okay, well, black is attacking the pawn on d5 twice, with the pawn on c6 and the queen on d7, and it's only guarded once with the queen on b3. So you could just take the pawn on c6. You could try to guard the pawn on d5 with a move like c4. But what white should really realize is that black's back rank is a little bit vulnerable. He only has a rook and a queen guarding the back rank, and the knight on b8 is blocking the rook on a8 from guarding the rook. So believe it or not, white could play a move like queen takes b7. Queen takes b7. Now the queen is attacking that pawn on b7, and the queen on d7 is guarding it. The problem is that queen on d7 is what we call overworked. It's guarding the rook on e8 and guarding the b7 square. So after queen takes b7, if black plays queen takes b7, then white can play rook takes e8 checkmate. All right, but what if black doesn't take on b7 right away? He could play rook takes e1 check first. Does that change anything? And the answer is no, it doesn't. Because after queen takes b7, rook takes e1 check, rook takes e1, queen takes b7, rook to e8 checkmate anyway. So can black do anything better? Can he maybe trade the rooks and then move the knight? No, because after queen takes b7, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, knight to a6, the queen is hanging, and also the rook is hanging, and even the knight's hanging. So after queen takes b7, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, knight a6, white has this nice choice of taking any of the pieces. Queen takes a8 check, will lead to mate on the next move after black interposes the knight and the queen. So when I should say the next move, maybe I should say the next two moves. So queen takes b7. Can black move the knight right away to guard the rook on e8? No, because queen takes b7, knight a6. Then queen takes d7, wins the queen for nothing. So black's got a lot of big problems in the position after queen takes b7. Suppose black just stops the back rank mate and plays h6. Okay, then at very worst, white can simply play queen takes a8, and now he's won the pawn on b7 and he's won the rook on a8. So queen takes b7, h6. If white wants to, he could trade off because he's going to be ahead, and when you're winning, you like to trade. So after h6, he could play rook takes e8 check first, and then queen takes e8, and then play queen takes a8, where the knight on b8 is then pinned to the queen. Not that it really matters, since white's up a rook anyway. It does. So black's in big trouble after queen takes b7. But if white instead just counts on d5 and says, oh, I'm losing a pawn on d5, I need to play like d takes c6, then that would be a terrible mistake, because black would just play knight takes c6, and now queen takes b7 would just lose the queen to queen takes b7, because without the knight on b8, the rook on a8 is guarding the rook on e8, and there's no back rank mate. I think most good players would realize this right away. They would look at the board and they would say, that rook on e8 only is guarded by the queen, but that means the queen is not really guarding the pawn on b7. What happens if I take the pawn on b7? Your ability to quickly spot these kind of seeds of tactical destruction, and I have an earlier video on seeds of tactical destruction if you don't know what that is. If you're missing the ability to spot these seeds and to notice that moves like queen takes b7 might be possible, then your tactical ability is going to be much, much, much less. You want to be able to be sparked by these ideas so that you have some ideas of how to go after tactics and with possible candidate moves. Now, do moves like queen takes b7 always work in positions like this? No, but that's why you need to understand that sometimes they do, and to be able to figure out, yes, A, queen takes b7 is a candidate move, and B, does it work? And then go through all the analysis and make sure it works in every single line. Because if you play the move and it fails in one line, but it works in all the others, and you don't see that, and your opponent sits there and figures it out, then of course you may have just lost your queen. So you can't just hope that it works in one line that you look at. You have to make sure it works in all the lines. That's not what I mean by hope chess, but a lot of people have quoted me as saying that that is what that means. That, you play a move where it works in 3 lines out of 4, and then you just hope your opponent plays one of the bad lines. That's not what I ever meant by hope chess. You can watch my video on hope chess if you want. But yes, that's something you can hope for in chess, is that your opponent misses things, but that's not what good players do. They make sure it works in every single line so that they're not surprised in any line, and no matter what their opponent plays, they make sure it works. If there's one line where it doesn't work, then they just don't play it. Okay, let's go to the next puzzle. 391. This is white to play. And again, if you want to play along with the video, you can put it on pause and try to figure out what you would do. Okay, well, the first thing we want to notice in this puzzle is if we count the material, white has a queen, black has a queen, white has a bishop, but black has a rook, so black's up the exchange. White has 3 pawns, black has 6. White's down 3 pawns. So he's down the exchange and 3 pawns. So winning a pawn here would not be very helpful. For instance, if we play a move like queen to b8 check, king to e7, well, I can't even play queen takes a7 because the queen's guarding it. So actually there aren't any pawns that we can really win anyway. But if we could win a pawn here, that wouldn't be very helpful because we'd still be far, far behind. We need something a lot more than just winning a pawn. Can we win a queen? Can we checkmate? Can we win the exchange? And the answer is no, 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 no. But what you can do is realize that if you're this far behind, you'd be very happy with the draw. So what we can do is we can look for ways to check his king forever. And we have 2 possible checks to look at, queen to b8 check and queen to f8 check. We don't just check just to check and see what happens. We have to figure out ahead of time. Well, if we look at queen f8 check first, black's only legal move is king to c7. And now white has no safe checks. If he tries to continue to check with queen c5 check, that black queen on e3 is very well placed to stop that. And white basically gets one check on f8, and after king c7, he could just resign. So queen f8 check is a terrible move. It doesn't do anything. Let's look at the other check, queen to b8 check. Now again, black only has one legal move. He has to play king to e7. And now white can put the queen back on e5 check and check the king again. And now the king only has two legal moves again. He could go back to e8 or he could go to f8. If he goes to e8, that's where he just came from, and we could bring our queen back to b8. And since the king to e7 was the only legal move for black, we could repeat the position. Well, that's very promising for white, because if he can repeat the position 3 times with the same player to move, he gets a draw, and a draw would be a great result in this position where we're losing. So queen b8 check, king e7, queen e5 check. So suppose black doesn't want to repeat the position and go back to e8. He could go to f8. So king to f8. But now white can play queen to h8 check. And again, black only has one legal move, king to e7, which allows white to repeat the position again with queen to e5 check. And now black has a choice of his poisons. He can go back to d8, where queen b8 check would repeat the original position. And he can go to f8, where queen h8 would repeat the position that they just got to. So that means that white has checks forever, which we call a perpetual check. So queen b8 check, king e7, queen e5 check, king f8, queen h8 check, king e5, queen e5 check. And now black can choose which way he wants to get the draw. King back to d8, queen to b8 check, king e7. At that point, if I was playing it over the board game, I would stop the clock. I would write the move queen e5 check on my score sheet. I would say to my opponent, I'm preparing to play queen e5 check. That will repeat that position for the 3rd time. I'm going to claim a draw. Do you dispute that? If my opponent says, yes, I do, because we haven't made the same moves 3 times, which is true, I want to dispute it. He can dispute it, but the rule doesn't say you have to make the same moves to create a draw. You have to reach the same position with the same player to move. And there, after queen e5 check, I've reached the same position, so the tournament director is going to roll in my favor. So he could dispute it, and then he would learn that it's not the same moves that draw, it's the same position that draws. Or he could say, you're right, we've reached the same position 3 times after queen e5 check, good game, I agree to the draw. And of course I could check him forever there and eventually get a 50 move roll draw also, but I don't need that. We have the 3-fold repetition rule. So queen b8 check, king e7, queen e5 check, king f8, queen h8 check, king e7, queen e5 check, king to either square, queen repeats the check, the king goes back to e7, and white writes queen e5 on his score sheet and declares a draw. Okay, so white would get a draw out of that. Let's go to the next one. Okay, white to play here. This is a position, I think, for one of my students' games. And in this position, my student recognized that the king in the corner had no moves, and if the knight could check the king, that would be a possible smothered mate. So he looked at knight f7 check, and he realized that black would have to play rook takes f7, and then he could play rook takes f7 and win the exchange, and that would be good for him. So after looking at that for a short time, he decided to play knight f7 check, and black played rook takes f7. And then after rook takes f7 for white, black played a takes b3, and if the knight takes on b3, black has queen takes d3, and even though black's down the exchange, there's still a lot of play in the position. So when I got to this position, I looked at it for something better. If you haven't stopped the video yet, you can look and see if there's anything better. And the answer is yes. If we look at all our checks, captures, and threats, we have a longer sequence. When you see a good move, look for a better one. The better sequence is rook takes f8. And now we're up a whole rook. If he wants to get something back, he has to play bishop takes f8. And now white can play bishop f6 check. And now black cannot play bishop g7 because knight f7 is checkmate with a smothered mate. So black would have to play knight takes on f6, Queen takes f6 check. King cannot go to g8. He has to play bishop g7. But that allows white to play queen d8 check. And after bishop f8, queen takes f8 is checkmate. So that means that after rook takes f8, black can't even take back because he's going to get checkmated, which means rook takes f8, wins an entire rook and threatens a checkmate. And now black's in much, 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 much bigger trouble than he was after knight f7 check. So here, we're using our tactical ability to realize that knight f7 check is winning the exchange. Again, winning the exchange means winning a rook for a knight or a bishop. White is winning the exchange, but his resultant position is not a trivial win, even though if white plays perfectly, of course he is winning. But if he plays rook takes f8, which is a much better tactic, a much harder one, but still very forcing. All the lines black has very few choices. After rook takes f8, white is much, much, much better off than he is after knight f7 check. So this is a good example of when you see a tactic and you think you're winning, you might want to look for a tactic where you're winning much easier. Knight f7 check is a win, but it's a tough win. Rook takes f8 is a pretty easy win. Okay, we have one more to go. Let's take a look. Number 393, I think, in my library here. Okay, this is a white to play. So again, if you want to play along with me, you can stop the video and see what you would do. Well, this is an example where if white tries to check with the queen first, let's say queen h8 check, king f7, the king is fairly safe. White can play g6 check here and get a really winning type of attack. But it's much better to do it in the opposite order. A lot of times when you see A, B, C, even though that's more forcing because every move is a check, in this case, it's better just to play g6, threatening queen h8 checkmate. And black's in big trouble. If he tries to run the king, then queen to h8 is checkmate anyway. So the only way black could prolong the game would be he'd have to throw a bishop in the way to give himself a square, and that doesn't save him. Bishop in the way, queen takes, king f8, queen checks, king e7, queen takes g7 check, king e8, rook h8 check, knight f8, rook takes f8 checkmate. So this is a very common pattern, this idea of playing g6 first to stop the king from running away. As I said, queen h8 check wins anyway, but it's not nearly so easy. It's much easier idea, and of course I've seen this idea a million times, that you play g6 first and try to stop him. Now, would this ever be something where it's not sufficient to win? Sure. And I decided to make another puzzle out of my puzzle in the book. This last puzzle is not in the book. I just made it up right for this video. And that is, can we make a position where g6 is a good move, but it's not quite enough? And the answer is yes. I moved the knight to e8, and I took one of the white rooks off the board. And now, if the queen plays to h8 check, and the king goes to f7, then white's got nothing. Black's just going to run away and win easily. So white has to try to play g6. And now, he's threatening that mate again. And as we saw, king f8, queen h8 is mate. So what can black do here? Well, notice black's up material. He's up a piece and a rook, which means he can afford to give away a piece. What he can do is play bishop h4. And now on queen takes h4, now run king f8 to stop queen h8 mate. And now on queen h8, he can play king e7, and the knight on e8 is now guarding the g7 pawn. And even though white has an attack, black's still up a whole rook, and black is doing okay. In fact, if we ask the computer here what's happening, it says black's winning. So it says here, the best play for both sides is g6, bishop h4 forced, queen takes h4, king f8, and now white should not go for the checks here. According to the computer, white's best move is the tricky move like knight on 1 to e2, trying to get that knight into the attack. When if black plays perfect defense here, with a move like queen to d7, he's okay. Let's say black tries something else like knight f6. Now the computer says white's attack is getting a little stronger with knight g3, threatening knight f5. And with perfect play on both sides, it would probably actually be a draw now. So knight f6 was a mistake for black. So this is actually white to play just to show you that throwing that bishop in the way is what will save the game for black. And now it's a very difficult attack for white, a very difficult defense for black. Both sides, whoever plays better is probably going to win. If both sides play like a computer after knight on 1 to e2, then black should win if he finds this move queen d7. But for a human, this is almost impossible to figure out the best defense here. It would take, this is one of those positions, if you let the computer play one side and you play the other, he's probably going to win on either side. All right, so this is a made-up problem that's not in my book, Back to Basics Tactics. All the other problems in our video today were from the book Back to Basics Tactics by Russell Enterprises. So if you're looking to improve your tactics and you've never read a chapter on advanced counting, if you don't have a chapter on defensive tactics or a chapter on is there a tactic, which was an important chapter in the book. I gave positions where there were seeds of tactical destructions, but there may or may not be a tactic, then my book Back to Basics Tactics may be for you. I'd recommend it for people rated anywhere from, let's say, 900 up to about almost 2,000. People over 2,000, I think they would know most of the more sophisticated things in the book. All right, for my video series on YouTube, if you're interested, you can hit the subscribe button, see how many subscribers we get. You can follow my chess tip of the day on Twitter at Dan Heisman. And if you're interested in taking lessons, check out my website, danheisman.com, and call me on Skype or phone or drop me an email, and I'll be glad to set up some lessons with you. Always glad to work with my students to try to make them better players. Hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.